I'm Ian Bremmer, president of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media.
And I'm Brad Smith, vice chair and president of Microsoft. Our Global Stage series gives you a front row seat at some of the most important gatherings around the world, from Davos to Munich to the UN General Assembly in New York.
And we host critical conversations about the biggest challenges the world is facing right now at the intersection of technology, politics, and society.
You'll hear from public and private sector leaders and innovators
on topics like cybersecurity, climate change, and ongoing war in Ukraine.
Join us for live streams, podcasts, and more throughout the year.
Head to gzeromedia.com/global stage and learn more.
Good morning, good afternoon, and hello, and welcome everyone. Welcome to a special GZERO live stream, a part of the Global Stage series that's produced in partnership with Microsoft. I'm Rahel Solomon. This week, leaders and delegates of 193 countries are gathering at the United Nations headquarters, right here in New York City, for the 78th General Assembly. The world is facing many challenges, from climate change to conflict, and there is no shortage of issues that require attention and immediate attention. Today, though, we're talking about technology. It can be, as one of our guests wrote, both a tool and a weapon. Our program is called Hearing the Christchurch Call. We will explain what that means and also how public, private, and civil society sectors can all work together to try to make cyberspace safer for all of us. I'm joined right now by Dame Jacinda Ardern, former Prime Minister of New Zealand and Special Envoy for the Christchurch Call, Brad Smith, the Vice Chair and President of Microsoft, and Ian Bremmer, the founder and president of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media. Welcome to you all. Great to have you.
Thank you.
Dame Jacinda, I think let's start with explaining the Christchurch Call to Action, and if we can even more broadly, remind us what happened in New Zealand March 15th, 2019.
Some of our viewers may recall that on that day, on March 15, New Zealand experienced something that has changed us forever. A terrorist who travelled to New Zealand with the explicit intention of attacking what they saw as a diverse and unified society by taking weapons into a busy mosque in Christchurch and taking the lives of, in total, 51 members of our Muslim community. They, at the same time, in order to help, in their eyes, share their manifesto and their ideology of hatred, live-streamed the attack. That attack was live-streamed for a full 17 minutes before it was removed, and in the aftermath of the attack, was uploaded onto YouTube at a rate of as much as once per second for a 24-hour period. And so just to give you a sense of the reach of that, I remember on the day of the attack, reaching for my own social media platform to let New Zealanders know where I would be and when I would be sharing more information, because it was understandably a horrific time for New Zealand and caused such grief and anxiety. And as I reached for my phone to be able to share that message on a social media platform, I saw the live stream. So many saw the live stream. And so in the aftermath of that period, we were absolutely determined that we wanted, in that moment in time that we had, where we had the attention of social media platforms in particular, to do something that would try and prevent any other nation having that experience again. So rather than just taking a very narrow approach to the issue, we decided to try and bring together interested parties. And I see interested parties as being tech companies as well, government and civil society, because they didn't want terrorism and violent extremism on their platforms either. Governments didn't want to see that proliferate in their societies and communities. And civil society had for a long time been promoting the very issues that we all cared about. So we created the Christchurch Call to Action in an 8-week period. It still continues to this day. We have 25 commitments, and we are continuing to work to ensure that we, as much as we can, remove violent extremism and terrorism online.
And so how does that work? I mean, explain to us a bit more about how you ultimately identify this extremism, but also ultimately stop it.
So everyone who will be listening to this will say the idea that your goal is to remove violent extremism and terrorism from the online environment sounds lofty, and it is. But surely we have to start out with setting expectations like that, because otherwise we create a tolerance that our online environments are unsafe and may cause people to have the kinds of experiences we saw where there was such overt radicalisation. So in our case, the perpetrator of the crime in Christchurch, he later identified that he was radicalised. In his own words, he claimed to have been radicalised by YouTube. So our interest then wasn't just what can we do to prevent live streaming as a tool being weaponised in this way. Our question was, how do we stop people being radicalised in the first place? So we've come together to ask these questions around how do we better understand the impact of, for instance, algorithms and the content curation that happens online. Big question. And when we started, researchers told us we don't have access to answer those questions. Companies told us we have privacy issues that make it hard for you to come in and answer those questions. So we created a tool. We funded collaboratively a tool that is allowing now, and we're in the early stages, researchers to be able to go in and access otherwise previously sensitive data whilst protecting privacy to help us finally answer those questions. And if we can answer them, then we can design solutions. That's just one example of what we've been able to do together. Unlike any other model, it is truly collaborative.
That's really interesting. Brad, let me bring you in here as Dame Jacinda talks about some of the changes to technology. There was, of course, as you know, a lot of attention on social media players, but also tech players after Christchurch because it was live streamed and because of some of what Dame Jacinda mentioned. What changes, how did that change technology after that event?
I think in some ways it is an extraordinarily important case study for everyone to think about, both in terms of how it came together, how tech companies and governments and civil society can work, and how you can operationalize the achievement of a goal. One of the goals, as Dame Jacinda was saying, is, in effect, it was like never again. Never again do we want the opportunity for somebody to live stream to the world the shooting of innocent civilians to potentially become an incentive to engage even in the act in the first place. So there were a number of things that came out of the Christchurch Call. One is what's called the Content Incident Protocol. Basically, you have the tech companies and governments and others, and people are literally on call, like doctors being summoned to the emergency room at tech companies and in governments, so that the moment there is such a shooting, everybody immediately is alerted. And
around the call 24/7.
Absolutely, 365 days a year. And so then consider this, since the 15th of May, 2019, unfortunately, there have been 450 of these kinds of shootings in 57 countries. And in probably a number that could be counted on one hand or even just a few fingers. Only in a few incidents out of those 450 did somebody really succeed at all in either live streaming or disseminating on a widespread basis the video footage of that act. And so that's a game changer. It took what happened in Christchurch and for 4.5 years, never again, in the same way. And so I think if we can do that, we can do other things, because that's a real that's real impact.
Ian, let me bring you into this conversation as someone, as an observer of political risk. When Christchurch happened, I mean, so many of us were horrified around the world. I mean, what was your perspective in terms of this moment, that moment?
You saw the failure of civil society to take care of one of the most dynamic, vibrant, and safe communities in the world. And I think that's what really hit home in not just in New Zealand, as Dame Jacinda was experiencing it, but for everyone that was paying attention. Like we know that the social media space is a polarizing place. It is a space that has a lot of disinformation. But everyone that saw what was happening at Christchurch recognized this goes well beyond what we can allow in our societies. And we also recognize that it wasn't governments that had the power to change this, by themselves. They could push, they could squeeze, but actually in the digital space, in the social media space, these platforms, technology companies exercise a level of sovereignty. So they had to work together. Right? Those were the two things from a political risk perspective that occurred, that civil society was at greater risk and vulnerability from the explosive rise of both productive but also disruptive technologies, tools that can be used as weapons, as Brad has said, and also that in order to respond to it, we needed a new type of governance. We needed a hybrid governance that was not going to just have the government leaders in the room. We talk about the United Nations, and you've got 193 countries that all come together. It's not just 193 countries anymore, right? It's a multi-stakeholder process, and we all have to understand what that means.
What's next for the call to action, Dame Jacinda?
It's always allowed itself to evolve with the new challenges that emerge, because our stated goal is to rid the online environment of violent extremism and terrorism. It leaves open the question of how that may be perpetuated or what challenges may be presented by new technology in that space. And so we've always had this additional work stream of new technology. It does mean we're looking now at the challenges and opportunities of artificial intelligence. And this was something that was put on the table at last year's Leaders Summit, where we came together to look again at our commitments, look at the next stage of work that we needed to undertake. And I say challenges and opportunities because on the one hand, we may see an additional contribution from AI to our ability to better manage content moderation. That may be an upside. A downside is that we may see it continue to contribute or expand on some of the disinformation which contributes to radicalisation. So here we see that there is a role for us in our minds to play alongside tech companies and civil society. And the challenge for governments is that we know what we know. It's very hard to anticipate where some of the technology will take us, let alone regulate around that. Regulation is a useful instrument, but not a dynamic one by design. And this is a highly dynamic environment. So this way of working allows us to be nimble, to be agile, and I think is the absolute approach that is required to put in guardrails that we need for AI.
Yeah, it almost feels like we're a bit at a crossroads when it comes to AI right now in terms of ultimately whether this is used net for good in society or whether it is used more so as a weapon. It's a perfect segue. If you've been watching, we've been talking about the Christchurch Call to Action. It's a commitment from more than 120 government, private sector companies, and taken forward in partnership with civil society organizations to combat terrorists and violent extremism content online. So, Brad, I want to begin with you. To say technology has changed enormously in the last 4 years would be an understatement. Dare I say it has changed enormously in the last year. Let's talk a bit about AI and the new technology and generative AI. I mean, how do you see that technology factoring into this larger conversation about combating extremism online?
Well, I'd first start a little bit with what generative AI means in terms of the development of AI, because AI has been here for a number of years. It continues to become more capable. It continues to become an extraordinary tool at, say, sifting through data, finding patterns and generating insights that humans would take a long time to try to do by themselves. Generative AI is then creating that capability and in some ways unlocking it for people, the ability to just ask questions, help them write, help them think, but also help them learn and then do new things. So then you come back to this space. It will be both an offensive weapon and an extraordinarily important, I think, defensive shield or tool. On the offensive side, take this whole area of content. Obviously, generative AI is the next step in the creation of content. And let's remember, this has been something that has been around for time immemorial. Photoshop changed the ability of people to create images. But now there's quite rightly a concern on things like deep fakes. And especially, I think, when it comes to deep fakes that involve either the creation of audio or video. That is probably the two areas.
Some of which can be really convincing.
Yeah, and it is both broad dissemination of content, but it can be, unfortunately, a very targeted scenario. It has become a problem in many countries where, say, somebody who's 80 years old and has a granddaughter gets a phone call from somebody who sounds like their granddaughter saying, I've been arrested, you need to wire money so I can be released from jail. With AI, you can emulate that granddaughter's voice at a whole new level. And you can also create content that is designed to deceive the public as a whole, especially, I would say, in the context of elections and other things. Now let's look on the other side of the equation. Just as the tech companies were able to come together and basically scan the internet on a 24/7 basis for something very specific like a shooting, we can, and in fact we already are, using AI to detect in real time the kinds of activities that cause concern. And I think the more we can build on the model for governance and collaboration, the more we can harness that power defensively.
So help me understand, though, I mean, in terms of seeing in real time and the pool of information that ChatGPT or generative AI, and excuse me if I'm interchanging things wrongly here, but how do you protect against it pulling from racist content or content that may not be as blatantly racist, but could still be discriminatory, people who perhaps use a wheelchair or something like that?
I think there's two things to think about there. First, there is the work that I'll say reputable, civically minded companies can do to build and deploy AI in a responsible way. And that definitely starts with the design team, having a diverse team, avoiding, bias and the like. It involves, thinking about the data sets that are there. But what it fundamentally evolves to is what we think of as a safety architecture. That is designed to put guardrails around the technology and prevent people from, say, using our service, an OpenAI service, to do the kinds of things that would inflict harm. That is critical. Now, there's a second problem. Even if our services do a good job, people can create their own from open source models. There are other bad actors in the world. So this is where, as Dame Jacinda was saying, regulation is critical, but it's not necessarily as agile as the response that will be needed. And therefore, if you rely exclusively on, say, just regulation and controls, you just don't have the ability, in my view, to detect and respond instantly to bad actors. And that's where I think that part of the model from the Christchurch Call is an important case study to consider.
No, it's a great point. So to that point, Dame Jacinda, I mean, how is Christchurch Call to Action considering this rapid technology in terms of the type of work you do? Because as you said, it creates both opportunities, but it also creates pretty unique challenges, I would imagine.
At the moment, what I think the Christchurch Call community is really offering up is a model, a demonstration point of not necessarily just solely solutions that have been generated, but just the way that we are going to best come to those solutions that we need in the future. And so whilst I'm not here today to say, here are a suite of responses for these new and emerging technologies, I am here to say, here is a way that you can find those solutions. I absolutely believe the multi-stakeholder approach, because it has been nimble enough to demonstrate when you've got questions, here's how we can open up and create the capabilities required to be able to answer them so that we can design solutions that actually respond to the problem. We can in real time say, well, we're missing a trick with not being able to monitor in a 24/7 way across the globe what's happening in an online environment and then respond quickly. Let's practically create a civil defence model online that enables us to do that. And then thirdly, let's help design a toolkit, a suite of policy responses within our own countries that can also respond to these challenges. So you've got the policy, you've got the pragmatism, and you've even got the enabling functions on research. There's not many places where you're able to move dynamically. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. And for anyone who's engaged in the model, they'll know that there have been times where we haven't been as fast or we haven't been as receptive as we've need to be. But relative to what we've seen, I think it is a model worth replicating on these challenges as we go forward. And not least, if I can add, because I think there has been there are trust issues out there. The public, I think, have looked out at the rapid development of these new technologies over time that they've been told will improve their lives. And yes, no doubt, there have been many enhancements, but there have been downsides as well.
Yeah.
And retrofitting guardrails after the fact is a much weaker approach than coming at it in its design and saying, in its inception, we have an opportunity that should not be lost, but we need to remember that the trust and confidence that we're starting out with is probably pretty low.
Yeah, the reason the Christchurch Call works is because it's a response to something that was so beyond the pale, and it's table stakes that even in a very deeply mistrustful and polarized and fragmented geopolitical environment, everyone can agree on that. You very quickly get into environments where that agreement falls apart. And we're seeing that, right? We're experiencing that, one person's obvious miscarriage of justice is another person's absolute free speech. You think about what was happening, with George Floyd in the United States, and lots of calls for righteous demonstration, and some of that, led to violence and riots. And there were a lot of people that wanted to see, that shut down. There are a lot of people that want to see expressions of white nationalism in the United States shut down. There are others that are actively promoting that. And we have to recognize not only is this what is truth, what is a part of civil society, what is basic human discourse, is fundamentally not agreed upon by large segments of powerful folks in society, but also at the same time, human beings are having their behaviors fundamentally shaped and affected, as Dame Jacinda said, by these algorithms. This killer, this murderer said, well, I was being affected by YouTube. There's no question that when we all grew up, we were affected by our genetics, and we were affected by the institutions around us, the family, the church, community, your local bowling league. We didn't have to worry about algorithms. Now we do. Algorithms are part of the solution because they drive so much productivity and efficiency. They are part of the problem because they actually create behaviors that we are experimenting real time on humanity. I feel very confident that the people that are running YouTube have zero interest in training people to become the next iteration of digital ISIS. I'm very confident of that. But I also know that we have not done anywhere near the level of work to understand the implications of these algorithms on the people that are using them, and especially on young people.
Yeah, and tell me more about that, because Ian, this year in your top risk report, you called AI, generative AI, a weapon of mass disruption. Tell me more about that for those who haven't been following your writings.
Well, I want to be clear. I didn't call AI only a weapon of mass disruption. I also called AI a tool of extraordinary productivity and growth. Indeed, globalization 2.0. But at the same time, fundamental to a democratic society, an open society, a civil society, fundamental to human rights and the United Nations Charter, is the idea that people are able to exchange information that they know is true, that they know is real. If you no longer understand a basic truth, you can no longer have a conversation. You can't engage with that person. You have no frame of reference. They are other. It's tribal. And that is what we're increasingly seeing happen. We saw it. People now, I'm not just talking about believing that the 91 indictments against former President Trump are or aren't real or politicized, though that's a big problem. I'm talking about the CDC. I'm talking about belief in scientists, belief in teachers, education, belief in the core segments of society, that when you lose trust in them, you lose your society. That's what I see happening. And when I see weapons of mass destruction and disruption, which, by the way, was a title that ChatGPT came up with. I inputted, here is what I see the challenge of AI. What would you call that? And ChatGPT came back and said, that seems like a weapon of mass disruption. Okay, I'll use it. Well, that was AI for utility. But then there's also many, many other uses. And that's where I think so much more work has to happen, because we all know, and Dame Jacinda's lived through this, we know that our democracies are fragile. Our societies are vulnerable, and we need to take action. If we can't just sit with where we are right now and think that these institutions will continue to serve us, because right now we are moving towards the delegitimization of these institutions.
Brad, let me bring you back into the conversation. We've been speaking about sort of some of the breakdown and public trust of certain institutions and organizations, but for the companies that are the major players in this space, there is also, of course, some trepidation. And I wonder if you can speak to what Microsoft specifically is doing to ensure that this technology is being used for net good as opposed to being used as a weapon of mass destruction or disruption.
I think that takes us back to a conversation about what I described earlier as a safety architecture. And to try to simplify it a bit, think about a generative AI, a model, an application, and then we put guardrails around it. And at one level, the guardrails are what we call classifiers. A classifier basically identifies a class of queries or requests or prompts or issues. So let's imagine that somebody goes to one of these applications and says, how can I best build a bomb to blow up my school? That is something that people could use the AI to do. Well, we have a class of prompts that identifies that. And you have to think about it. There's probably 1,000 different ways to ask that question. There's lots of different words that one can substitute. So you've got to build the capability to identify all of the different permutations. So that's one guardrail. And then the other guardrail is what we call a meta prompt. What a meta prompt does is basically it intervenes in real time before the answer is provided and says, in effect, we're not going to answer that question. And instead it gives a different answer. The different answer is typically, that is not something I am willing to do. Or imagine, because this happens, somebody says, how can I commit suicide tonight? And the meta prompt intervenes and says, what you really should do is reach out to get some counseling. Either here's a hotline, you can call this number. But that concept, those concepts basically come together and they help ensure that a reliable, reputable service is only used in a way that we would regard as societally appropriate, that we're able to put certain activities out of bounds and stop its use for that purpose. And a lot of what you're seeing right now across the industry and around the world, really is about how you do better testing when these models are created, how you identify the potential harms, how you put in place a variety of controls to mitigate and stop them from happening, and how you build a safety architecture. And the last thing I would just say is what we're really trying to do as a company is creating safety architecture in effect as a service so that Meta, for example, can take its open source model and it can deploy it in Microsoft Cloud data center, and it will benefit from our safety architecture. A professor here in New York City can create an open source model, can make that model available to the world, but the professor, I would bet, doesn't want to see the model abused. So the open source model can run with that safety architecture as well. So that is one good idea, and it's going to take more than one good idea to advance all of this.
Let me stick with you for one more moment. Do the tech companies have to get it exactly right in order to ensure that nothing bad happens? And I wonder if it keeps you up at night that maybe the teams aren't thinking of every prompt. I mean, what concerns you most, even despite the efforts that Microsoft is taking to get this right?
Well, just as in the world today, for many technologies, you deploy technology and then you constantly monitor it, you need to do that here as well. So that's why, for example, the airplanes that we all fly, the monitoring of the safety features doesn't stop once the plane has been certified. And that's why we read stories about, well, this plane is being grounded or there's a safety check and all of these things are being done. And I think, unfortunately, what we are experiencing in this area is no one can predict the enormous creativity of humans in a world with 8 billion people to do something we didn't think of. And that's why we constantly have to be on the alert for something we didn't imagine. Now, the good thing about this technology is that once you see it, you can add a new class, a new classifier, often within 24 hours.
Right.
So that malleability, that agility is far more powerful than it is to say, get out to every commercial aircraft on the planet, some new component that will fix something.
I do think, though, that one of the expectations that the public may have on us, and I accept this is difficult, is rather than to think about this in the frame of monitoring and response, to instead think in the frame of anticipating and protect. Because we've been in a world of testing new technology in real time, and we've seen the harms. And so I think there is that expectation on all of us, and I do think that there is a genuine desire there, but we need to rebuild trust, and now is the time to do it.
And I think that's absolutely right. I mean, first of all, we should just, reflect on the lack of trust. It's a real challenge. There was a Pew Research study just about a month ago that showed that in the United States, 52% of Americans are more worried than optimistic about what AI will mean for their daily life. Only 10% are more optimistic than worried. So 52 to 10. That's not really what you want to see when you're trying to invest in developing a new product. And so we've got to address the full panoply of issues. And I couldn't agree more. We have to do everything we can to anticipate. And I am optimistic that as we get more experience, we will build out our ability to anticipate more. And it's also why our view has been if you have technology, AI, for example, that is used in certain high-risk areas, then one ought to think about whether there's a licensing requirement, whether that license needs to be obtained before it's deployed, and whether there are then post-deployment obligations that you need to follow in order to keep your license. Just like you have to drive safely in order to keep your driver's license, I think you could say the same concept is applicable here.
Isn't it fascinating, though, based on that consumer research? If you were a company developing a product that was to go on the shelf as a kind of a more traditional consumer product, on that kind of survey, no one would launch that product. They'd say no consumer's going to go out and buy that off the shelf because there's not enough trust in what I'm trying to create.
Look, I mean, the genie's out of the bottle.
Exactly.
Right?
I mean, this will be part of, it's already, and as you say, it is already part of life, and it's going to continue to be.
These models are being used. They're being used by everyone. They are open source in many cases,
Indeed.
right? And many have said that was irresponsible. But, if it hadn't been that, it would be someone else in the next 3 to 6 months. Brad made a point I think is very important earlier in the conversation, which is that within 18 months of any one of these models coming out, they've become massively proliferated. Mm-hmm. And the people that are engaged in those proliferations and customizations, many of them will have none of the interests of ensuring that they will be responding in ways that deal with public safety. That many of the companies, though not enough of them, do think is part of their corporate responsibility. And what does that mean? Well, first of all, it means that we have to think of regulation of this technology very differently than the way we've thought about a lot of other technologies. So increasingly, when I hear about 5G and Huawei, and I hear about semiconductors and TSMC, the Americans and allies have increasingly New Zealand too, actually, which was more like in between before.
You might need to give me an example of that so I can challenge you. We are country neutral and very careful in the way we analyse potential risks.
No, absolutely. I'm thinking just in terms of how the Americans are trying to ensure that all allies are not, for example, giving away the store to the Chinese, right? So there's been a big conversation about technology Cold War and a presumption that, any time a new technology is being rolled out, it can be quantum, it can be biotech, it can be AI. Well, we just need to make sure as the Americans with all of our friends that we are containing the Chinese and we're building out this technology with our friends in a responsible fashion. It is very clear from this conversation that AI will not be governed that way. Right? That the principal actors out there in driving both opportunities and dangers from AI are not going to be just folks in Beijing and Washington and their allies. It's going to be everyone. And so you need to have a much more prudential approach to thinking about the regulation. It's going to have to be multi-stakeholder. It has to be global. It's a very different approach than what we've seen on technology from Washington for the past years.
And so perfect segue. Actually,
go for it.
So this is because, I mean, there's so much to talk about, but that is a perfect segue. We're going to turn now to governance and global collaboration and the many stakeholders that are required to advance online safety. So ahead of the UN General Assembly, Ian Bremmer sat down with the UN Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez. Governance and regulation of AI was one of the topics, and here's a bit of that conversation.
I just saw Ursula von der Leyen of the European Union at her State of the EU, and she called for a UN-led intergovernmental panel on artificial intelligence. Nice to see the head of the EU calling for the United Nations to take a strong leadership role here. Do you think that's feasible? And how can the United Nations help to respond to this very, very fast-moving challenge?
Well, first of all, the decision will be a decision of member states. Let's not forget it. But we will put in place, immediately after the General Assembly, a high-level advisory body on artificial intelligence to work with me to come with concrete proposals in this regard. And for me, it is clear that we must have some kind of global entity. There are different models that have been put on the table. One is the International Agency of Atomic Energy. The other is the IPCC, the Scientific Board of Climate Change. We need to have some kind of global entity in which there is competence, technical competence, and in which there is some monitoring capacity and eventually some regulatory capacity, and at the same time to be a platform in which the different actors come together, including, of course, the companies. The companies, including the scientists, including the civil society, because governments alone will not be able to tame this complicated animal that is artificial intelligence.
Do the member states, are they prepared to accept an institution where the governments don't have all of the power? I mean, that's the reality, but are they prepared to accept that reality?
We'll see. I believe that there needs to be an intergovernmental part on it, but also there needs to be a platform on the key stakeholders need to be present for us to be able, as I said, to move in an effective way to guarantee artificial intelligence is a fundamental tool for our common development, and it's not a threat for the future of humankind.
So Ian, let's unpack a bit more what Secretary General Gutierrez is saying there. One, I mean, where are we on this sort of global governance? But two, is it happening fast enough and quickly enough to keep up with this rapid proliferation like you were talking about earlier?
Fast enough.
Or at all.
People have been working on developing AI for decades now, and no government officials at a high level considered this a priority until a year ago. I mean, last year at the UN General Assembly, I can think of about 30, 35 bilats that I had over the course of the week. It did not come up once. It is now coming up in almost every single meeting. And I'm sure that's true for Dame Jacinda. I'm sure that's true for Brad as well. Because, you know, governments understand that this is systemic, it is transformative, and they're not ready. They don't have the expertise, they don't have the resources, and we don't yet have the architecture. So we're late. Of course we're late.
Too late?
But no, not too late, but I mean, at least there's urgency. I mean, usually there's, when you have policy issues out there, there's so many that people kind of know what they think the answer really should be, but they just don't have the political will, or it's just too hard to like address the political capital in the United States. You think about gun control, you think about immigration, you think about all these like big issues that sensible people on the left and the right know what right compromises could be, but they just can't get there. This is exactly the opposite, right? This is one where the people in the room do not actually know what they should be doing. And so the talk is actually the thing. I think that AI is the single most important conversation happening in this city this week. Because, you know, on climate change and on the war in Ukraine and the rest, like, it is talk, but unless you show me the money, you get something done, we know that nothing's happened. In AI, the talk actually is absolutely essential. Who are the actors? What do they think we need to do? Set the stage, set the global stage for where AI is going to go. And again, a multi-stakeholder conversation. So far this week, I see a radically different perspective on this than we might have expected even a few months ago.
So, Brad, really interesting, because as Ian says, the urgency is there, the will is there, but the technical know-how may not be there yet. But you are in a position where you actually do understand the technology, and you're having these conversations with policymakers. If I remember correctly, I mean, you were on Capitol Hill a week ago having conversations with U.S. leaders. I mean, what are you telling them? I mean, what is your perspective in terms of how to bridge that gap so that governance can begin?
I would say first, learn from what has worked. And if you look at the Christchurch Call, and if you look at the White House commitments that were announced on July 21st with 7 companies, including Microsoft, you see some real similarities. First, you see a shared focus on defining the problem. You can't have a solution if people can't agree in the first place on what the problem is. The second, and I think this is a really interesting lesson, is a collective conversation on what kind of solution might be applicable. It actually started in the cabinet room of Prime Minister Ardern when I, by coincidence, was in Wellington 2 weeks after that attack. And in a very similar way, 4 companies were brought into the White House on May the 9th. And the conversation was people at the White House saying, we want you all to tell us what you think might work. Now then, there's a third dimension, which I think is fascinating. Never just leave it to the industry to do what we think in the first instance is possible or maybe even easy to do. And so what Prime Minister Ardern did was then say, that's a good start. I want you to do more. And she worked the phones, she called companies, and then had a collaborative conversation that her team put together in San Francisco and sketched out the details. In a very similar way for these White House commitments, there was this meeting on the 9th of May, and we were all told we had to submit proposals by the end of May. And Microsoft, we got our assignment in first. We thought, this is good. We're really industrious here. And we did it within about, I think, 9 days. And then by coincidence, I was in this building and had a call with Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, who basically playing the role of Prime Minister Ardern was Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce. And she said, this is good. Basically, she said, you get an incomplete. You got more work to do. I like everything here. Now I'm going to give you some more things. I want you to go do more in these spaces. But then what is also fascinating is that kind of collaborative exercise. Within 2 months, produced the Christchurch Call. And in 78 days, on July the 21st, produced these White House commitments that then 7, not just 4, but 7 companies signed up and said, we will pursue. That is how you make progress. Then you have to keep broadening it, and you need an international architecture for global governance, but understand the problem and agree on it. Start to talk with companies, what can you do, and then push the industry to go farther and bring everybody together.
Dame Jacinda, as we talk about the different stakeholders that are required and the multi-stakeholder approach, I mean, walk me through how you're applying this to the work at Christchurch Call and how you're using this technology.
Yeah, I'm going to double back a little bit to one of the comments that Ian made a little while ago, where he was just demonstrating the different debates that are going on in real time that affect what we're doing currently with the challenges of new and emerging technology, but also what we're still trying to do to address some of the online harms that are contributing to violent extremism and terrorism. And if you look beyond just, liberal democracies, on the one hand, you have the discussion about free speech and the view that some hold around being able to use online platforms to publish just about anything. And then in some countries, the inability to publish anything at all. And so there is a huge diversity of debate in this space. Now, our argument was, instead of coming at this from just a country-specific approach and who's at the table and who's not, base your agreement around who sits with you based on a value set. And our value set from the very beginning was a strong focus on human rights and a strong focus in the belief that we could create technology and an internet for good. So bringing those two objectives together, that was the basis, the foundation principle for what we could agree on. If you agreed that securing human rights online was important, and that a free and open internet was important, then those were some of the barriers to entry, rather than just taking a country-by-country approach. And I'd say the same again here. Let's establish the value set, the common problem identification to bring everyone around the table. And if we're too narrow in our focus, we'll miss a trick, because there will be this constant evolution of challenges that we'll face. But if you can establish that and from the outset bring people together, then you too will be continuing on 4 years down the track with a model that is actually generating results. I think it's great that the United Nations is talking about how to do this. Institutions, so in the past, have struggled to create the dynamism and the pace required. I hope that we don't see anything stall, because we can't afford it in terms of time.
Well, Ian, let me let you jump in here, because I wonder, from your perspective, everyone's at the table now, certainly here, but what needs to happen in terms of even reaching a preliminary framework to move forward?
Well, Brad said something I very strongly agree with, which is that if you can't define the problem, you will not have a solution. So the first thing here, where people don't understand what AI is capable of, the opportunities, how they can align with the Sustainable Development Goals in the UN and ramp them up where progress has been lost through the pandemic and the Russia war, but also the dangers to civil society, the dangers to the global economy and the rest. That can be done. It can be done in very, very polarizing spaces. The UN has done it before. That's the idea behind the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I mean, 30, 40 years ago, the climate denialism, and maybe it's happening, but it's cyclical, and maybe it's not cyclical, but it's not human beings that's actually driving it, it's not industrial processes. We've seen that play. We now know that 193 countries all agree we've had 1.2 degrees centigrade of warming. There's 441 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. We know the impact. And once you have that, then you can take steps on deforestation and on biodiversity and on carbon trading and the rest. If you don't, and even if you don't have collaboration, if everyone understands the rule space, the problem space, then the steps that they will take even by themselves will move them towards the direction of the goal. Well, that's where you need to start on AI. You have to have a multi-stakeholder approach. The governments, the corporates, civil society actors, and they need to understand the nature of AI opportunities and challenges, and that needs to be updated on a real-time and ongoing basis, because unlike climate change, a snapshot every year ain't going to get you there, right? But that's the table stakes, and the United Nations is not only suited for that goal, and they've shown that they can do it before, but they are uniquely suited for that goal. There is no other organization in the world that reflects a global perspective and is aligned, as Dame Jacinda said, with common values, is united with human rights, with an internet for good. I mean, the UN was based, I'm very proud that it's my country that created it, but it was on the carnage of World War II. And it was created with an understanding that all of us that almost didn't make it, right, we actually do share some basic values in humanity. They are enshrined in the UN Charter. They are enshrined in the Declaration of Human Rights. That needs to be done for artificial intelligence.
Let me end with, I'd like all of you to weigh in here. It's been 4 years, let's bring it back to the top, after Christchurch. Are we better, are we safer than we were then? And the reason why I ask is because, we have this conversation, and yet I feel like as a journalist, I don't have to look far to still see examples of someone acting on online extremism. And so I wonder, from each of your unique perspectives, where we are compared to March 15th, 2019.
And look, Brad already touched on some of the specific areas where you can say, when it comes to, for instance, and this is only one element of our ambition, when it comes to the live broadcasting of violent and terrorist content, you have not seen something like March 15 since. But that was only one part of our ambition. Our ambition was to address the radicalisation that's occurring in the first place. Now, is that challenge getting better or harder? There are more inputs now that are making that challenge more difficult. And that's why the relevance of the Christchurch Call still exists. So there is architecture now, and we operate differently. We have that crisis response model. The world is different now. In some places we're doing better, in some places it is more difficult. That's why we have to keep going. But what I would say is that we will not see beneficial change unless we all accept our individual responsibility as well. Now, for governments and for political leaders, my question to everyone would be, how are you contributing to creating a society that can have healthy debate and build healthy democracies? Because we are operating in a more fractured environment. And when that happens, you do see that tribalism and you do see those silos. And that does contribute to what is already a difficult online environment. We have a job to do there as leaders and as political agents. The tech companies, I would ask them again, they need to keep addressing what role they are playing in that online environment as well, be it with some of the existing challenges or the emerging ones. And politicians aren't the ones necessarily to solely design what the expectation of them is. It must collaboratively we can though. And then for civil society, they've always been there asking of us more. Now we need to continue to give them that seat at the table so that we can see the change as a result. I'm an optimist. It is a challenging time, but I'm an optimist and I still work in this area because I believe we can keep making improvements.
But I imagine you're optimistic about this space. You would have to be. But so tell me your perspective here.
Well, I would take almost a philosophical perspective, and I would very much agree. Look, human civilization came together and started creating cities about 6,000 years ago. The first democratic societies emerged about 3,000 years ago. You never get to a point where people stop worrying about crime in the streets or free elections for a democracy, education for children. The world keeps changing. Technology, especially over the last 300 years, has been probably the biggest catalyst for constant change. You identify problems and you knock them down. You try to build stronger societal pillars so that there is more resilience and agility. I think I take a lot of hope from the Christchurch Call. And I think what we fundamentally need, and it is a segue in some ways to what Ian keeps writing about, is whether we fundamentally have the right governance pillars for societies around the world to be agile and effective in protecting the public in, call it, the second quarter of the 21st century. And that's why I think we should focus on technology, but use these technology issues not only to address the problems that always concern us, but to build more of that societal resilience that the world needs along the way.
Yeah, and the stakes are so high. Ian?
I completely agree that the Christchurch Call has done an enormous service on a very small issue, but a very important issue. The broader point, am I optimistic? Of course I'm optimistic, at least hopeful. But we cannot think that we are heading as societies in a positive direction on this issue right now. You say, as a journalist, the level of hatred and invective that you will be exposed to on a daily basis is a lot greater than it was 10 years ago. Right? Some of it's about your gender, some of it's about your race, some of it is completely random and not understandable, but it still exists, right? And we're all experiencing that, and we shouldn't be. And that's going to be made more challenging with AI. It's going to be made more challenging because one of the most important social media networks in the United States and more broadly is presently owned by someone who proactively promotes and engages with some of the absolute worst actors in creating divisions and hate. That's an issue, right? I mean, we need to recognize that just as some governments have very big debates on we're not going to allow anyone that we disagree with to put anything in our social space, authoritarian regimes, but that's also true of some of the technology actors themselves. So we need to understand there's a spectrum of behavior here, and the fight is going to be won not just by having the right sort of governance and bringing heads together, but also ensuring that some of the actors that are actively disruptive don't get to make the rules set by themselves. That will be very dangerous, and we need to take that on.
A lot more to discuss, but I know we have to go. Dame Jacinda Ardern, Brad Smith, Ian Bremmer, thank you all for the conversation. I thought it was really insightful. And a quick programming note for those watching, GZERO will be live again tomorrow from inside the UN headquarters at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. You will see Ian and Brad there alongside the UN Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, and other distinguished guests. And you can follow all of GZERO's coverage of this 78th General Assembly. Head to gzeromedia.com/global stage. I'm Rahel Solomon. Great to be with you. For all of us here, thank you for watching and have a great day.